Our next speaker today is Dr. Viswanath Devanarayan. Dr. Devanarayan is a senior director at GlaxoSmithKline and is also an adjunct professor at the University of Illinois in Chicago. He's going to talk to us today about reproducibility assessment of in vitro screening results. Devin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Serene. Thanks to NCATS, other colleagues in NCATS for organizing this workshop and for continuing to invite me to speak at these workshops. We've been doing this for several years, and it's been a pleasure to go over the various concepts that are covered in the assay guidance manual that's in the NIH website, NCATS website. In fact, we cover some content that goes beyond some of the topics that are in the manual. And so thank you all for choosing to attend this workshop. We normally do this in person, but given the current situation, we're having to do this in a virtual format. Usually, so when I do this in person, you know, especially for the nature of my content, it tends to require back and forth during the presentation. So it works best when people ask questions while I'm talking, interrupt me, and then get clarifications. But that's not so easy to do in this virtual format. But please send your questions via the chat box or Q&A box in the webinar. And in fact, it's okay, Abigail or Serene, to interrupt me in the middle and read those questions out while I'm presenting. So it doesn't have to read it.
Thank you. Thanks, Devin. We will do that.
Okay, great. Okay, I do have a hard stop though, unfortunately, after my talk because I have an internal work meeting to attend that I cannot skip, but I'm available. So there's a roundtable at 12:30. So if any of you have questions after my talk, you can come to the roundtable and ask those questions, or you can reach out to me directly via this email address that is provided here. Okay, so TC has given a very nice overview of the various concepts around high throughput screening data, statistical concepts around it, and it provides a nice segue to the topic that I'm going to cover, which relates to how you go about assessing reproducibility of potency results and potency-like data from in vitro screening assays. Most of what I'm going to cover are described in detail in these chapters of the assay guidance manual and also in the publication that's provided to the end. So you heard about ZPrime Factor from TC, a very nice overview that he gave about how it was derived and the history behind it, what it means and all of that. So in summary, basically, so let me use a laser pointer option so you can see my, okay. So you basically generate data at two extremes, right? So you have, say, data at background or blank sample, and then or negative control, or and then data at the extreme, another extreme, which can be positive control, or this can be presence and absence of enzyme, depending on the assay format. So you basically generate replicate data at two extremes, and plot. So if you plot it this way, and you obviously have some variability around these values at the two extremes, and you calculate the variability at these two extremes, and 3 times of that, 3SD, will give you a dotted line that's shown here for the top signal, and 3SD from the background will give you this dotted line that's shown here from the background signal or the negative signal. And this difference here between this gap between the 3SDs of the top and bottom is really the focus. And that goes in the numerator of the ZPrime calculation. And what goes in the denominator is the full window from the top to bottom signal. Okay, so the higher the variability, right, the narrower this region becomes. And so and therefore lower the numerator of the ZPrime, and therefore lower the ZPrime factor. And given the way it's defined, I mean, it's got a natural range of 0 to 1. And as TC was explaining, I mean, anything greater than 0.4 or 0.5 is considered reasonable. An additional point that I'd like to make on top of what TC has said is the variability that you're calculating here should reflect all sources of variation in the screening data, depending on the intended use of the assay. I mean, so if you're going to be generating data from compounds over multiple plates and days, and if multiple analysts are going to be involved, and if multiple labs are going to be utilized for generating the data as well, you need to take all of that into account in calculating this variability. All right? Because if you don't do that, you're underestimating the ZPrime factor, obviously. So that's really important to keep in mind. And another thing is, you see, is this denominator that I have here. So if you're testing compounds, say in triplicates, then you plug in the value 3 here. If you're testing compounds in singlicates, you don't need that. But if you're testing it with all the compounds in duplicates or triplicates or how many replicates, the number of replicates that you'll be using to screen the compounds is what goes in this n here in this calculation. And what I often see is Z-prime estimates are derived based on just one plate of data. And that means you're using only intra-plate variability. And again, I mean, as I said, if you're generating data over multiple plates and days and analysts and so forth, that is going to be not an appropriate estimate if you just use one plate of data, because you only take the intra-plate variability into account. So as I've said, so I mean, I don't want to keep repeating this too many times, but I mean, I see this so many times that I'm sorry I'm belaboring on this point. This is really important to keep in mind. When you're calculating Z prime, or when you see somebody reporting Z prime, feel free to ask how they calculated it, what sources of variability they included, and whether that reflects all the different sources of variability that you're going to be seeing from the compounds that are tested in the screening assay. So that's the point I wanted to make on top of what TC had covered regarding Z prime factor. So this is another a point that is related to what TC said, and just wanted to reiterate that as well about the concept of signal to background ratio versus Z prime. So here's one assay where the signal to background is 10 for this assay here, and for the second assay it's around 8. And for the third assay, it's around 5. A lot of times, people just use this window, the signal to background window, to say, okay, which assay is better. So when you spend many days and weeks optimizing your assay, and if you're using signal to background as a criteria for determining which antibody concentration or enzyme concentration or incubation time or whatnot is the best, the optimal condition for the assay, in this scenario, you might say assay 1 is the best and assay 3 is the worst, right? Because assay 1's got better window, signal to background ratio than assay 3. But if you take the variability into account and calculate Z prime, it's 0.4 for the first assay, 0.6 for the second assay, and 0.75 for the third assay. So based on the Z prime criteria, it's the other way around. Assay 3 is the best, assay 1 is the worst. So it's really important to take the variability into account. Whether you use Z prime or whether you use some other metric, whatever metric you use, make sure the criteria you're using is not just based on the signal, but it also takes into account the variability. So it can be signal to variability ratio, and Z prime is just one form of signal to variability ratio. It takes into account of the signal in the top and bottom, and also the variability in the top and bottom. So relying only on the signal to background can result in suboptimal and incorrect conclusions, as you saw in this extreme example here. So moving on to the core topic of my presentation, when you're dealing with potency results from in vitro screening assays, right? Z prime, while it's good for getting an idea about how much variability is there, whether they can differentiate actives from inactives, hits from inactives, and so forth, when you're dealing with potency results, Z prime of greater than 0.5 is not automatically going to imply reproducible potency values. So what we really need is, because ZPrime is just based on the actual signal values, right? So it is not based on the variability of the potency data. So what we really want is to take the variability of the potency data into account and to come up with a metric that is like ZPrime, that serves the same purpose as ZPrime, that can be used to judge whether the potency data you're going to generate from the screening assay is going to be reproducible and robust and reliable. So we need a ZPrime-like metric on potency data. And that's led to the development of this concept called minimum significant ratio, or MSR. It's the smallest potency ratio between any pair of compounds that can be considered as statistically significant based on 95% confidence criteria. But of course, you can alter this confidence criteria and define the MSR based on 80% confidence and 90% confidence as you like. But based on the level of confidence you like, you can set the MSR formula accordingly. The default is 95%. And the formula looks like this. So it's 10 to the power of 2 square root of 2, standard deviation divided by square root of n. I'll go over this in much more detail in the coming slides. And the standard deviation here is the variability of the replicate log IC50 results derived using different sources of variability that's relevant for the potency assay, a screening assay. So if you're going to be testing the compounds over multiple days, including multiple analysts and labs, then you got to take all that variability into account when you calculate the standard deviation of the log IC50 values. So this MSR value serves a similar purpose as the ZPrime factor, in that it represents the overall quality of the assay. So whatever the value it turns out to be, that value can be used to say, okay, that's the smallest ratio that you can see, that you can say between any two potency results is statistically significant. So let's go into more detail on that. Suppose MSR is 5, okay? Then if a particular compound's IC50 is say 100, then we don't have enough confidence to say that this compound is meaningfully different between any of the other compounds in this gray zone here, between 20 and 500. So we don't have adequate confidence to say that this compound here is different from any of the other compounds that have IC50 between 20 and 500. So in order to say this compound is different from the other compounds, those compounds should be either less than 20 nanomolar or greater than 500 nanomolar. So that's a pretty big gray zone. But that's important to keep in mind, because when we're doing SAR and other things with the screening data, we're constantly looking at these IC50s as just real values, true values. And we go ahead and say, this compound's got IC50 of 50 nanomolar, other one is 75, so this 50 is more potent than 75. But the 50 and 75 could be within the region of noise. So next time you test those two compounds, they may flip, or they may be 60 and 62. So that's why it's really, really important to take the variability into account when we make these decisions on which compounds are better, and rank order these compounds, prioritize these compounds. And before even you start screening the compounds, you want to know what the MSR is, so that if the MSR is high, then you know that there's going to be a lot of noise in the data, and the hits are not going to be reproducible, and the decisions you make on moving compounds forward can be clouded with a lot of noise. Okay, so that's why this concept is really important. And one question I often get is, if you say MSR of 5 applies to all the compounds you test in the screening assay, that's the intended use, right? So you're calculating an MSR, and you're saying that value of MSR is now represents your ability to differentiate any two compounds at random from the screening assay. And you're saying it's any two in the entire range, an entire collection of compounds you have that you test in the screening assay. Now, how is that valid when you've got this situation here? And this is what you commonly see. Here is the IC50 of all the different compounds plotted against the variability of the IC50. And what you almost always see, and this is just the inherent nature of the potency data, what you almost always see is that the variability goes up as the potency goes down or the IC50 goes up. So when that's the case, and variability is proportional to the IC50, how can we say that this single number of MSR of 5 is relevant for any two compounds in this range, in the entire collection of compounds? So in the actual live presentation in person, I normally ask the audience, okay, what's going on? And so here in virtual format, it's difficult to do. So the answer to that is over here. So this, what I'm plotting here is the IC50 data against the variability, right? Now, if you take the log transformation of the IC50, you plot the log IC50 against the variability of the log IC50, the same data, right, looks like this. So in the log scale, IC50 is stable. The variability is stable across IC50. And MSR is derived from the analysis of log IC50, not the actual IC50. So therefore, that's what makes the MSR representative of the entire range of the IC50s of a screening assay. And that's why MSR is a reasonable index to use for no matter what compound you have, for the entire collection of compounds. And this is true for almost any, I mean, I've got the range here is somewhat narrow, but I mean, no matter how wide the range is, this is generally true. When you take in the log scale, the variability is much more stable. And that's what makes the MSR, which is calculated in terms of log IC50s, that's what makes it a reasonable metric to use, regardless of whether you're dealing with a highly potent compound or a very weak compound. So this is another really important concept to keep in mind, because when you're trying to use this concept, you may get this question, and this is the answer to the question. So building from that, how do we calculate MSR? So it's as I said, based on the log transformed IC50 values. And it's derived from the idea of 95% confidence interval on the difference of two log potencies. So, and as most of you know, the confidence interval for the difference of any two values can be written in this way. This is a formula for the confidence interval where you calculate the difference first, and then you add and subtract 2 times square root of 2 SD over square root of n is a standard error, and 2 here is approximate threshold for the 95% confidence. The square root of 2 comes from the fact that you're taking the difference. So in this case here, we're taking the difference of two log potencies. So y1 and y2 are the two log potencies, and standard deviation is the difference of the log potencies. And this factor here, this factor that you add and subtract, is what we would call as a minimum significant difference of log potencies. And what's really important to keep in mind is that this number n is the number of times you intend to test the compounds in the screening assay. So similar to the comment I made about ZPrime, here as well, for MSR calculation, if you're going to be running each compound, say 3 times, and you're calculating 3 IC50s, and these are independent repeats, by the way. So I don't mean like in the same plate, you run the compound in dose response format in duplicate. I don't mean that duplicate. I mean independent repeats of compounds. If you test each compound, say 3 independent times in different plates or different days, that's what I mean by the number of replicates here. So if you're testing all the compounds, say twice in the screening assay, then you plug in the value of n equal to 2 in this formula. If you test all the compounds 3 times, you plug in the value n equal to 3 in this formula. So I'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a later slide, but that's what this n here refers to. It is not the number that you use to calculate the SD. So that's different. And again, I'll get into that in a bit more detail later. But this n here represents the number of times you intend to screen the compounds. And in fact, you can even see that if I test, you can even use this as a criteria for determining how many times to test your compounds. And we'll talk about that again in a later slide. Did somebody have a question or a comment? Okay, I heard some background noise. All right, so now taking the anti-log of this basically is what gives you the MSR. So this factor here is coming from the difference of the log potencies, right? And so this factor, therefore, is a minimum significant difference of log potencies. Now you take the anti-log of that, that's what gives you the minimum significant ratio. So MSD becomes MSR. That's why we're dealing with ratios. So if you're just calculating, if you're working with the original log IC50s, and if we calculate the MSD of the IC50s, then we are running into this other issue, right? So we're going to deal with this problem here. And if I don't do the log transformation, then I'm going to calculate MSD of the original IC50s. And that's not appropriate because of the fact that the variability is going up and it's not stable across the range of IC50. So I got to take the log transformation in order to make the MSR more representative across the entire range. And I calculate the variability of the log IC50, and then I take the anti-log of that to get the MSR. And in order to make sure that whatever I'm calculating is representative of the entire range of the compounds that I'm going to have in the screening assay. So that's where this formula comes from, and that's the rationale that we use to derive this. So what's a reasonable criteria for MSR? So unlike ZPrime, where we can use statistical arguments to come up with what value of ZPrime is appropriate, here it's based more on the practical side of things. So we're saying that, it's really up to you. I mean, so we're saying, how much of a threshold are you willing to tolerate? And from our experience, working on many different screening assays from different projects and different organizations, what I've generally found is that people are generally okay as long as MSR is less than 3. Most people are happy if MSR is less than 3. But again, I mean, if you're dealing with a different scenario and you want a tighter threshold, we can set a tighter threshold. But from my experience, generally less than 3 is considered reasonable. It means you're saying that as long as any two compounds have potency values within 3-fold of each other, and as long as you differentiate anything that's over 3-fold, then you're happy. Then that's what you mean when you say that MSR is less than 3 is adequate. It's usually when it's greater than 3 that triggers a lot of questions and concerns. But even then, if you're dealing with like profiling assays and off-target assays, and if you're dealing with a broad range of actives and hits, then in those cases, MSR of 3.5 or 4 is not a huge concern. But when it does become a concern, then you can test the compounds more than once. So if you test it twice or thrice, then the MSR automatically goes down. As you saw in the formula that I showed earlier, dividing by the square root of n in that formula, see, the more times you test the compounds, the lower the MSR is going to be. And that's one way of bringing the MSR down from greater than 3 to less than 3. And we'll go over that in a bit more detail in the later slides. So, but if MSR is too high, like some of the cell-based assays and some of the more complex assays, it's tough to have MSR with very low MSRs. And in those cases, you may want to try re-optimizing the assay to see if you can get the MSR lower. Because if you test the compounds 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, you're basically lowering your throughput that many times. So it significantly increases your workload and cost. So that's not your ideal solution. So what's ideal is to re-optimize your assay, get your assay with as few replicates as possible, just even 1 replicate or just two tests. If you can get the MSR within 3, that's ideal. But if that's not possible at all, then of course you have to test more than once. So here's an illustration of what I was trying to say about the impact of the number of times you test the compounds on the MSR itself. So here you've got 3 different scenarios. So here's one scenario where the MSR is 10 to begin with just a single run of all the compounds, the MSR is 10. And over here, MSR is 7 to begin with. And then over in for the other assays, MSR is 4. Now, if you test compounds from these 3 assays, say 2 times, then the MSR comes down to around 5 in this scenario for this assay. It comes down to around 4 for the second assay, and it comes down to less than 3 for the third assay. And if you test them 3 times, it goes down even more, and 4 times even more. But after a certain point, you're not getting much returns. It's a law of diminishing returns applies here, so you don't want to test too many times. If you're already starting off with a reasonably good MSR, and for the receptor binding assays usually, and that is typically used in HTS, your MSR with even N of 1, you test all the compounds once, and the MSR in that scenario is already usually less than 3. I mean, I've often seen MSRs of 1.5, 1.7, less than 2 for many receptor binding assays with just one run of all the compounds, N of 1. So in that case, I mean, testing all the compounds twice is not going to add much value. You're not going to get much gain in terms of reproducibility. But if you're starting off with a highly, relatively more variable assay, so the N of 1, the MSR is say around 4, then testing it twice makes a difference. But then if you're testing it 3 times, it makes a slight improvement, but 4 times is not a huge improvement. So you can use this sort of rationale to also argue with your colleagues about the optimal number of times to test the compounds. For example, I've seen scenarios where some of my scientist colleagues who were running the HTS were asked to test the compounds 3 times, no matter what. No matter what, they were asked to test all the compounds 3 times. And he came running to me and said, you know what, Devin, I mean, I'm seeing this MSR of 2.5 already with just one test of all the compounds, and they want me to test it 3 times. So, and how do I argue that it's not necessary? So I said, the answer is very simple. Calculate the MSR for N of 2, calculate the MSR for N of 3. So when your MSR for N of 1 is 2.5, the MSR for N of 2 is not going to go down too much. Maybe it's 2.2 or something. And N of 3 is going to go down slightly, very, very slightly. So he was able to use those arguments with the project team colleagues and say, hey, I mean, if I test it once versus 3 times, the MSR goes down only by a small value. And so we're not gaining much in terms of reproducibility of these potency results if we test the compounds too many times. So in the end, he was able to argue in favor of going down from 3 to 2 for that particular assay. But this is how you can go about making decisions. And you can use objective criteria like MSR to decide how many times to test the compounds. And the other extreme, I mean, you may have to, argue in favor of testing more times. So if you're dealing with the highly variable assay to begin with, you may say that, okay, I've got an MSR of 7. It's a cell-based assay and done everything I can and re-optimized the assay, but this is the best I can do, MSR of 7 to begin with. So what you may say is you may test all the compounds 3 times, and that brings MSR down to 3, but you don't have to do it for all the compounds. So let's suppose your hit criteria is, say, 1 micromolar. You may say that you'll only test all the compounds that have IC50 or EC50 less than 3 micromolar or 5 micromolar. And on the highly inactive compounds, you can just leave them alone. There's no point in testing them too many times. But the ones in the borderline, the ones that are you're claiming to be active, you can test them 3 times in order to get the MSR within a reasonable value. So that's another way to go about applying MSR in those situations. So how do we go about estimating MSR? There are different ways of doing this. And depending on where you are in the assay development stage, I mean, you can use different types of data to calculate the MSR. So if you're just about ready to start screening the compounds, you can calculate what we call as retest MSR. Another term is replicate experiment MSR. So here you just test a batch of compounds, say a couple of times, 2 independent times, and you look at those 2 independent repeats and calculate the variability of those data and plug the variability into the formula of MSR and report the MSR based on that data. And once you've started screening compounds, you can use the positive control results over time to calculate the variability of the positive control and use that information to calculate the MSR over time. And also at different points during the screening phase, you can look at all the compounds that have been tested up to that point, and whichever compounds have been tested 2 or more times, you can utilize those data to calculate what we call as a retrospective MSR. Excel tools are available in our AGM manual, the NIH INCAT's website, for the calculation of test, retest MSR, and moving MSR. Retrospective MSR is a bit more complex to do, requires more complex modeling. So you may need to consult with your friendly statistician to help you do that. But I'll show an example where I say that actually using just moving MSR based on reference compounds is a good approximation of the retrospective MSR based on all the other compounds. It's generally true from many assays from my experience. And I'll show some data to make that argument. So test retest MSR, as the name suggests, you're basically testing a batch of compounds twice. It mostly captures the within run variability. Between run, you only got 2 runs, right? So you have a very weak estimate of between run variability. And so it's not a real reflection of the true MSR. The true MSR is taking into account of the intra-run and between run variability over time. So this is kind of underestimating the true MSR, but it's a filter for moving forward with the assay. So if this MSR is not good, given that it's underestimating the true MSR, if this MSR is already high, you know that the true MSR is going to be much higher. So if this MSR is, say, 4, you know the true MSR is going to be much greater than 4. So this is a filter for making a decision on whether your assay is good enough to start screening the compounds. So this is something you do before you start screening compounds. And there's a simple tool in the website, as I mentioned, and in the tool, when you plug in the data from the 2 repeats of the batch of compounds, you get a graph like this. You get a graph of the ratio of the two results, 2 potency results, plotted against the average. Each point here represents different compounds that are tested. And this line here is a mean ratio across the 2 repeats, and the confidence interval of the mean ratio and the confidence interval around the individual ratios are shown here. And the MSR that you calculate based on the 2 repeats for these different compounds, it turns out to be 3.54. So, I mean, again, as you can see, I mean, this MSR, as I said earlier, it's underestimating the true MSR because it's mostly taking the within run variability into account. So if this MSR is already high, like it's 3.54 in this scenario, you know that this assay may not be ready, it's not good enough to start screening compounds. You may have to go back to the drawing board and see if you can re-optimize the assay. Or of course, the other more laborious solution is you may have to make a decision to test all the compounds twice. So if you test all the compounds twice, then there's MSR of 3.54, maybe going down below 3. So that's the way to also make a decision before you start screening compounds, how many times you should test them. So if this test rate test MSR, like it's shown here, is already high, you may make a decision then that at least in the first few months when you're screening compounds, you may want to test all of them twice or thrice. And then you can adjust accordingly based on the variability that you calculate over time. All right, so how we calculate it? I mean, it's based on just the repeats of of the 2 results. The repeats of each compound over 2 runs, and you take the log transformation. You take the difference of the 2 log values, and then you take the standard deviation of the difference, and plug that in. Calculate the MSR as shown here. And this is all done automatically in the Excel tool. So when you go in there, you just have to paste the data from the 2 runs of the batch of compounds, and then everything else is done automatically. The graph that I showed at the previous slide, MSRs and the confidence intervals, everything appears automatically. Now, this analysis can also be used to make decisions on whether, on other things that you deal with when you're developing the assay. So when you're comparing different reagent lots, when you're comparing different assay conditions, different assay formats, you can use a similar test retest concept to compare the data in this way and see whether the changes in those conditions make a big impact on the variability. So to improve the MSR estimate, it should reflect both the intra-run and the inter-run variability. And for that, you need data across, the multiple runs in the screening phase of the assay from, the different compounds that you test in the assay. So this can be captured in terms of the moving MSR as using reference compound, or what I call as a retrospective MSR, or historical data MSR using data from multiple compounds. So what's moving MSR? So this is calculated using only positive control, as I said earlier, and you basically work in increments of 6 runs. So you work with data from the first 6 runs, the positive control from first 6 runs, calculate variability of that, and then calculate the MSR corresponding to that. And then you use the positive control data from runs 2 to 7, calculate the standard deviation of that, and then the corresponding MSR, and that's the MSR for runs 2 to 7. And likewise, you just keep going, runs 3 to 8, 4 to 9, and so forth. It's like a sliding in 6-run increment over across the multiple runs of data that you have, and using only positive control. That's why it's called a moving MSR, right? Because the MSR of the positive control is basically moving with time. You're sliding that MSR in 6-run increments over time. So you can plot the potency data over time, and you can plot the moving MSR over time, and that basically becomes your control chart, moving MSR control chart. So this is also useful for tracking the quality of the assay. So you can flag at different points in real time if something is going wrong in the assay, then you will see the MSR is going up, and you can immediately go back and diagnose what the problem is and try to fix the problem before you start using the assay for testing more compounds. So here's an illustration of that. So here's the potency data of a reference compound plotted over time. And here's the corresponding moving MSR graph for this potency data of the reference compound over time. So what we're essentially doing is we're calculating this standard deviation of the first 6 runs of the positive control, and using that we calculate the MSR, and then you keep doing that for in 6-run increments, and you update the MSR values accordingly. That's what gives you the moving MSR graph over time. And there's an Excel tool for this. So all you have to do is enter the run dates in the IC50s, and you'll get the moving MSRs right away, along with the graphs that I showed earlier. And you can also use all of the data over time from the reference compound and calculate the overall MSR. That's referred to as the cumulative control MSR. And here's an illustration for one of the assays. So this is potency data over time for this kinase assay, and the corresponding moving MSR graph for the same data. So you can see when you look at the potency data over time, I mean, you can see a lot of wobble over time. And it's not, you can see some extra wobble here and some extra wobble here, but it's not really obvious at what point you should be concerned, which runs are really bad. There's no objective way, an obvious way to flag the bad runs in real time. That's why the moving MSR graph can be really useful. So when you plot the same data in terms of moving MSR, you can see around July timeframe, when there's some extra wobble, that results in a significant elevation of the MSR. You see, it's stable around 3, and it goes up to 7 or 8, then comes back down. So you should be doing this in real time. So when you're over here and you suddenly start seeing the MSR go up, you can go back and see what the heck is going on with your assay. Did a new person come in, or you have to change the protocol, or something went wrong in some of the reagents that you're using in the assay? You can go back and ask all those questions. Instead of just continuing to test all the compounds over time, just put a stop right there in real time, and try to diagnose the issue as you go in real time. And that's why this is a really useful quality control check as you go about testing various compounds over time. So here's another example from a different assay that makes the same point. So it's a really useful metric for not only assessing the overall MSR for your assay, but also a nice quality control, real-time quality control tool for tracking the quality of your assay and flagging bad runs. Retrospective MSR, as I mentioned earlier, is calculated using multiple runs of data from all the other compounds you have in the screening assay, and there are more statistically rigorous analysis, and you can apply mixed effects modeling here to do this analysis and calculate the retrospective MSR based on all the different compounds you have in the assay at different points during the screening of during the life of the assay. And in this particular example, you can see the overall MSR is around 3.4, taking the intra and interrun variability into account. But from my experience, the MSR based on just the positive control alone is a pretty good reflection of the MSR based on all the compounds you have in your screening assay. So here are this is real data from multiple assays. These are some kinase assays here, some cell-based assays, a GPCR binding assay, and this is the overall MSR based on just the positive control. And this here was the MSR based on all the compounds that were tested 1 or 2 or more times in each of those assays. And you can see that they track pretty closely to each other. It's beautiful, isn't it? So that's what's amazing about this. I mean, and this goes back to the argument of the log transformation that I mentioned before. I mean, just the positive control variability seems to reflect the variability of a wide range of compounds you have in a screening platform. And that's because of the fact that in the log scale, the variability is constant or usually across the entire range. The exceptions can be when you've got some poorly soluble compounds or unusual compounds. Those may present higher variability, but those are compounds you should be discarding anyway in some of those cases. But in general, you'll find that the positive control represents pretty well in terms of variability, and the MSR based on that is a pretty good reflection of the variability that you have for that you get from all the different compounds you test in the assay.
Devin, you have a question. Sorry to interrupt. You have a question?
Okay.
So one of the questions that you have, it says, if you track a moving MSR for a control chart, instead of considering all historical data at the same time, do you risk missing a slow drift or any other trends?
Wait, whatever the trend drift is, I'm not sure I catch the question. So drift in terms of the potency values, the positive control over time, like if it's going from 10 to 20 and then 20 to 30 and then 30 to 40 as a systematic shift. Yeah, that should be reflected in the variability you calculate. So if the drift is random and it's 10 nanomolar in one run and then goes up to 20 and then 25 and then comes back down to say 15, then 8 and then 10 and 9. So it's a random drift. You'll see that in the graph, then the corresponding MSR will reflect that. But if it is a systematic shift, that should also be reflected in the variability that you calculate, especially when it starts drifting. Now, when it's gone from 20 to 30, for example, and then it's hovering around 30, then the MSRs may look good after that point. But you know, when it went from 20 to 30, and that time frame, the MSR would have gone up quite significantly, or the variability would have gone up quite significantly. And so at that point, you can say, okay, you can go back and look at what's going on and see whether something went wrong with the assay and try to diagnose that issue. So at the time the drift occurs, the systematic shift occurs, that should manifest in terms of the higher variability. And you can try to go back and see what's going on and try to fix it. But if it's a very slight systematic shift, then you may not see it in terms of the variability increase may not be dramatic enough, and the MSR increase may not be dramatic enough. But at least in the potency, that's why we want to plot both the potency data and the MSR data. These graphs should go hand in hand. And you'll see these two graphs appearing, showing in the Excel tool that you have. Right. So yeah, I mean, these are all things to look for when you're using these tools, and in real time you can try to diagnose them. I know I've already run out of time by a couple of minutes. If there are further questions, come to my roundtable at 12:30, or just send the questions to Serene or Abigail offline, or to me directly by email, and I'll try to address them later during the roundtable. But the remaining few slides are simply an extension of the MSR concept for selectivity assays. These slides are pretty self-explanatory, very easy to follow, very easy to calculate these MSRs for selectivity assays. The selectivity assays are pretty important for many discovery projects in the pipeline when you're trying to minimize off-target effects, against undesirable targets. You calculate selectivity ratios, and you're making decisions in terms of how much selectivity you have, and is the selectivity really meaningfully different between two compounds. For those applications, the MSR concept is very useful as well. And you can follow along the information that's in these slides that are pretty easy quite self-explanatory. So any questions you have, just come to the roundtable and ask, or just reach out offline. And thank you again for your attention.
Thank you very much, Devin, for a wonderful presentation. As Devin said, there are slots open in his roundtable. So please feel free to reach out to Abigail on the chat box so that you can join Dr. Devanarayan's roundtable. Okay, so with this, I think what we have next is a short break. So we will reconvene at 10:45. We'll see you back at 10:45 to continue our program. Thank you very much.